Greetings and salutations. I'm Larson Halleck, semi-certified anthropologist, and it's time to deliver another Manthropology video, because the world desperately needs anthropology without pause. And today, let's talk about one of the great canonical works of renegade anthropology, Dr. Lawrence Keeley's The War Before Civilization. As I've repeatedly mentioned, the noble savage ideal is implicitly a major cornerstone of modern leftist anthropology, no matter how much they deny it, and one of the major cornerstones of the noble savage ideal is that the indigenes, untouched by civilization, never knew violence until the big bad colonists brought it to them in the form of doing violence upon them. And of course, they really want to believe that somewhere in some wonderful little corner of the earth, there are still tribes that have no interpersonal conflict at all. And of course, those magical tribes are all devout feminists that have no concept of gender roles. There's a very good reason why I put The War Before Civilization in the intro to all of my Manthropology videos, because this book is an absolute demolition of the idea of non-violent, happy, primitive indigenes. Keeley's heavily footnoted analysis shows that, proportionally speaking, primitive warfare, whether looking at archaeological evidence or modern hunter-gatherer tribes, is every bit as brutal and deadly as modern warfare, and in some ways is more efficient than modern warfare. To cite one example, page 34, pre-modern Tahitian tribes mobilized 50% of their men for combat, and in primitive war, all men are on the front lines. In contrast, even Nazi Germany could only mobilize 30% of its men for frontline combat roles, and the rest of whom were in support roles. But the key is in equality to modern warfare, because many tactics of our primitive forebears, or modern hunter-gatherer tribes, are equivalent to modern tactics. In one example, making flint arrowheads specifically designed to break off the shaft and hook into the enemy's flesh. In another example, soaking spears and arrowheads in rotting flesh and various poisons specifically to give enemies a long, drawn-out, and painful death. And what is that, if not a biological weapon? Higher forms of violence are also found in primitive societies, namely extortion. A cited example is of the New Mexican Pueblos, who found it advantageous to trade with, i.e. give shit to, Comanche marauders to avoid violence, hundreds of years before the white man came, page 124. Indeed, the fighting men of primitive societies are in some ways smarter and more strategically gifted than the civilized man. Keeley mentions New Guinean chiefs who, upon seeing an airplane for the first time in his life, requested a ride and to be allowed to bring a collection of boulders onto the plane for the purposes of dropping upon enemy villages that the flight route would pass over. His request was denied. In contrast, it took civilized man 10 years to discover the military applications of airplanes. You want more? There are numerous prehistoric examples of fire being used as a weapon and force multiplier. Prehistoric massacres of groups of people, another use of terror as a force multiplier, and of course, the extremely high prevalence of trophy taking in primitive warfare. Yep, turns out that the white man taught the Indians to scalp story is a complete and utter lie. But more than just a look at the savages tome, Keeley seeks to explain the how and why of primitive violence, how it can be so efficiently brutal, and why is that the case. A major theme to understand with these sorts of studies is that of proportionality. An example will explain what I mean by this. The most common form of warfare in hunter-gatherer societies is constant back-and-forth raiding that seek to bushwhack any man, woman, or child they can find. By constant, I mean 25, 30 in a year. On average, these raids kill 3, 4, 5 people each time, and here's why you must take into account proportions. Killing a few people every month is devastating for a small tribe of 1,000 or so people. Indeed, Keeley describes a pre-Columbian incident in Canada, in which a series of low-level raids between the Doe-Grebe and Yellowknife tribes culminated in a raid that killed 35 Yellowknives, accounting for 25% of their population. The Yellowknives never recovered, and the descendants of the demoralized survivors were absorbed into another group. To put this into perspective, if the USA lost 25% of its population, it would have lost 77.5 million people. Not even the Soviet Union in World War II lost that many people. In addition to demolishing the myth of peaceful savagery, Keeley also devotes some time to skewering conventional military thinking. Chapter 5, The Skulking Way of War, is essentially an extended deconstruction of civilized notions of elan and tactical disciplinary superiority leading to victory. Abundant evidence reveals how primitives, who, bear in mind, have usually been informally training in their battle methods since they could walk, are frequently throughout history capable of winning battles with civilized, disciplined soldiers when on even footing, and how logistical superiority, combined with tactics adopted from the primitives, is ultimately what leads to victory in colonization, with an implication that an ideal fighting force would be a force of trained guerrillas with the financial and technological resources of a first world nation. Indeed, the phrase "the skulking way of war" comes from an American colonial authority referring to how much more effective the Native American method of fighting, which is to say, ambushing, guerrilla warfare, attacking non-combatants and supply lines, utilizing force multipliers and terror, was than the white man's battle lines and regimentation. Thus, the white man quickly adopted it and used it upon the Indians. Now, of course, on that note, I am not denying that colonialism delivered many cruelties and atrocities to the indigenes. Undoubtedly it did, and Keeley certainly does not deny this. He goes to great pains to show how, in contrast to the Hobbesian ideal of all against all, even the most bellicose warrior societies expressed a distaste for war. War is bad and nobody likes it, says a Papuan headhunter on page 144. Similarly, he describes how a surprisingly common feature of primitive warfare is that a warrior who has killed a man in battle has to, in some fashion, spiritually and religiously cleanse himself of this heinous deed through various means like rituals, sexual abstinence, fasting, etc. On page 146, he even describes prophetic nightmares of veterans of primitive battle that we can recognize as PTSD symptoms. The nigh constant warfare of primitive tribes seems to stem from a combination of resource competition, with the high-minded justifications typical of civilized warfare like revenge and safety, and the underlying paranoia that simply if they didn't do it, those other people across the hillside would. Knowing all this, we can see that Keeley is not a frothing right-wing bigot who wants to slander the poor, innocent, noble savages. Indeed, I don't think one could be a University of Chicago PhD in anthropology if you were, but merely a scientist who wants to present the truth as he finds it. He asks why has the past been artificially pacified, citing an example of a higher up going out of his way to deny that an archaeological site showed fire was being used as a weapon. And in his analysis, he pulls no punches. Hell, on page 23, he basically refers to white guilt by name. This atmosphere of Western self-reproach and neo-Rousseauian nostalgia is prevalent in anthropology. His answer? A combination of the nuclear age making war into suicidal folly, and the disappearing primitive from a combination of increased industrialization and increased communication, making the world smaller, made it very easy to romanticize the primitive and thus lead into a Rousseauian resurgence. Not mentioned in the book, but inferred by myself, is that noble savage ideals in spirit, if not name, have existed pretty much as long as civilization has, notably Tacitus. After all, it's very easy to romanticize the noble savage when the savage is not nobly burning down your homestead and raping your wife. And finally, Western man's desire for atonement for his perceived sins leads to him wishing tribal peoples to be more righteous and spiritual from the perspective of Western man, of course, and accepting the myth of a lost Eden encourages man to put off fixing problems that they have in modern society. He who makes a beast of himself gets rid of the burden of being a man. Keeley doesn't mention, however, that the everybody is the same anthropology had already existed since the turn of the 20th century, really. So if anything, the war and nuclear proliferation were just the proof that college kids needed to confirm that their professors were right. Western society is inherently evil, and of course, once cemented into its current form, it rapidly spread. In fact, Keeley seems to argue that more progressiveness is the answer, which is the main point that I disagree with. People today believe in progress more than ever. Nonetheless, Keeley is more sensible than the overwhelming majority of his leftist brethren. Worth noting is that Keeley does not automatically deem a nation state as being more dangerous than the one-world fantasy. The antidote is an effective political organization with regulatory powers, whether it be a band, a tribe, a nation, or the earth. And on that, we do agree. I am certainly not going to say that the primitive is inherently bad. I feel that various peoples and social structures have evolved to fit their locales and needs, and thus I wouldn't want to impose my own culture on others. However, considering the ubiquity of violence amongst human groups, why should we exacerbate it by mixing incompatible peoples together? I'm Larson Halleck, and I appreciate humanity in all of its splendor.